Hey, Pastor Andrew here. Thank you for joining me on this series, Jesus the King, a study of the Gospel of Mark. Really, we're spending time in the Gospel of Mark. We're just going chapter by chapter. Here we are finishing up chapter number 2 for this week. And I want to say thank you for joining me. And if you're just new to us, man, continue to join us. We're just going to take our time and go through the Gospel of Mark. We're doing this on Sundays as a church, West Valley Foursquare Church, and then also we're going to be kicking out these devotionals during the week. So let's keep moving in chapter 2. This is one of those passages also that is so fascinating. So Mark chapter number 2, verses 18 to 22 will be where we'll take our devotion and our thought for today. Now, John's disciples, this is John the Baptist we're talking about, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast, Jesus? And then Jesus said to them, well, can the wedding guest fast while the bridegroom is with them? The answer is no. As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. And then he gives kind of a parable, almost a riddle. It's one of those things where you just really can take your time thinking through this. He says, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, then the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. You know, this is also one of those passages that I have spent time just thinking about what that means. And this is kind of culturally relevant in their first century context and culture. To my knowledge, we don't use wineskins anymore, but that was their method of preserving and storing wineskins. And I know that maybe have you read like this before where you know that there's a lot there, but you're not picking it up. This is one of those passages for me. I've read on this and there's a lot of depth to it, but it's kind of like I read it and then I can find some good stuff in commentaries or surveys or other things that are about this passage or in the original languages or whatever, if I'm reading some sort of exegetical teaching. But what's interesting is, man, I know that this is a loaded phrase. Like, this is really loaded, but I'm not sure that I'm picking everything up that you're laying down, you know? But it's a great passage. And so Jesus is saying here, the day's coming when his disciples will fast. Obviously, we should be fasting. You know, I go back to Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, when Jesus has this long sort of, discourse he's teaching and preaching. And he just says, when you pray, right? When you pray, when you fast, when you give, there's this sort of aspect of that's what you're going to do as a Christ follower. You're going to do these things, not if you do them, but when you do them. So fasting is something we should do. It should be a part of our life, a lifestyle of fasting. But I want to focus in on this idea of the wine and the wineskins, because Jesus is bringing something. He's changing a paradigm. And so you have the scribes and the Pharisees who have received, again, what we call the Old Testament, but it's the Hebrew scriptures and the Mosaic law and this understanding of how to relate to God. And Jesus is fulfilling all of that and saying things are going to be new. In fact, what Jesus brings and what Paul explains in the New Testament letters is that Jesus brings in the new covenant. And he brings in the new covenant through the shedding of his perfect blood. And so we know that in the communion, in the Eucharist, where Jesus says that you take the bread and you take the wine, which is symbolic of my body and my blood. And so there's sort of these correlations and these things that work together for us to consider what Jesus is talking about. And as Jesus is saying this, you can't put new wine in old wineskins. I think there is an aspect of, again, this is probably really profound, but I can think at least a level of it is going to be the fact that he's teaching these disciples, the new wineskins, about this new covenant. And if Jesus were to just come and grab some educated Pharisees and scribes or Sadducees and try to teach them, they're so wrapped up in their tradition, they're so wrapped up in their understanding and their way of life and their way of relating to God and their right, because they've studied the scriptures, that they're the old wineskins. They would burst. Like we wouldn't have the story that we do with the disciples, where when Jesus ascends and the Holy Spirit falls, I mean, they set the world on fire in a good way for God. And the disciples are spreading and preaching and teaching the gospel. And Paul becomes a Christian and he travels the world in missionary journeys and sets the world on fire for Christ in a good way. You know what I'm saying? Would that have happened if he had used educated scribes and Pharisees? I think that there's a little bit of a nod that way with this idea of new wine and new wineskins and old wine or new wine and old wineskins. I think there's something there. I hope that you're following what I'm saying. We have to be careful not to be so caught up in our tradition that we're missing what God is doing. Now, obviously, the first layer is the fact that Jesus is bringing a new covenant. That's kind of the point, I think. And so Jesus is teaching this, there has to be fresh wineskins. These people are not biased in a sense. They're not jaded by, I already know the answer, Jesus, and you can't tell me. I mean, these guys are fresh and they're malleable. They're able to be molded and understand what Jesus says, and they're humble enough to make the mistakes along the way that even after Jesus ascends in the book of Acts, we see the early church stumbling through their way, trying to figure out what is God doing. And I love that it's authentic, it's real, and they're humble. But maybe the system, the educated Pharisees and scribes, and they would have just been too much in the system to really appreciate what Christ is doing. So think about that, chew on that a little bit. I think that's what Jesus is saying. And so the challenge then for me, and maybe the challenge for you, is that we can get so stuck on a certain level here. We can get so stuck in our church tradition, in our ways. You know, maybe you were brought up Presbyterian or Lutheran or charismatic or Catholic. You have this certain tradition that you have, and you think this is the way. Like, this is the only way to really know Christ. Or we have a fuller understanding or a more mature understanding of Christ than these other denominations. I think we have the possibility of becoming an old wineskin, or sort of like an old wineskin in that way, and not really catching the fact that Jesus has called us to love. And he's called us, like we talked about in the last devotion, to cut through social barriers and be love and be life to people so that they can really experience the love of Christ. And so I think about that, man. I don't want to be so caught up in a tradition that I miss just the authentic thing that Jesus has taught and what Jesus is challenging us to do. So consider that. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but I hope that this ministers to you, that it blesses you. If this does speak to you, then I'm going to ask maybe you consider liking or commenting or sharing or subscribing this to your friends and family. And we're just going to continue to spend time in the Gospel of Mark. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.